Welcome to this episode, Monday, 15th of November, on Being with Jesus Continued Reading. We are doing both Hebrews 7 and 8. Chapter 7 and 8 is one of the so-called tougher portions of Hebrews, mainly because we are, in a way, non-Jewish in our thinking. Okay, in order to understand these two chapters, you have to have a Jewish mind. Now, when we use the word priest, to us, we mean maybe a pastor or a priest in a Catholic church and all that. But in the Jewish mind, a priest is very, very different. A priest is so-called from the line of Levi. Okay, a very clear line, genealogy. And you must be descended from Levi in order to be a priest. Nobody else can be. Okay, and to be a high priest, you must be the line of Aaron. Very specific. So when the Jew talk about priest, it's not like, you're called to full-time ministry, become a pastor, you're a priest. They got totally different mindset. Okay, so as you read this whole chapter 7 and 8 about Melchizedek, it mainly centers around the whole area, the priesthood. For a Jew, the priest must be from the tribe of Levi, full stop. But suddenly we have this person who is not of the tribe of Levi, who the Bible acknowledges as a priest. And that is something that we need to discuss and resolve, okay? So today, I'll make it a bit easier for yourself and myself, okay? I've taken from Bible Project. Bible Project did a whole series on priests. I've joined together 4 of the 5 segments, okay, which I think will help us. It runs through all the way from creation, all the way to Jesus, and gives an understanding of the whole priesthood. I think that's important for you and I to understand. After that, we'll discuss about Melchizedek.
We are walking through the story of the Bible, focusing on the role of priests.
And that story begins with God creating a garden called Eden,
where heaven and earth are one.
And God places humans in the garden to be his royal image, his priests, so that humans and God can work together as one. And this whole setup is called God's blessing.
But tragically, the priestly humans are duped into rebelling against God and then exiled from the garden.
But God promises that one day a descendant will come to defeat that evil deceiver and restore humanity as royal priests. And we learn he'll be both a priest and a sacrifice.
But as it stands, humanity is outside of Eden, and things have spiraled into chaotic violence.
But God chooses from the wreckage a couple, Abraham and Sarah. And God calls them to journey to the land of Canaan, and he promises to give them a huge family and all the blessings of Eden.
Now, the blessing isn't just for them. The goal is that God's blessing flows through their family out to all the nations.
And so that makes Abraham's family like a priesthood.
So is Abraham that royal priest we've been hoping for?
Well, no. But Abraham does meet a mysterious figure who reminds us of that promised royal priest.
And who is this?
Well, Abraham is returning victorious from a risky battle, and he passes by the city of Shalem, and this king comes out to meet him. And we're told that this king is also a priest who serves the same God that Abraham does.
Ah, yes, Melchizedek. This man's a mystery. We don't know why he worships Abraham's God. We don't even know his family lineage.
Exactly. But here's what happens. Melchizedek brings this great feast out to Abraham and his army, and then he gives God's blessing to Abraham, saying God is the one who gave him this victory over his enemies. Then Abraham gives Melchizedek 1/10 of everything that he has, and that's the story.
So what is it all about?
Well, Melchizedek is the king and the priest of Shalem, which is an ancient name short for Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, which will later become the capital of Abraham's future family, where the temple is built. And that 10% that Abraham gives Melchizedek, that's just like the 10% Israelites will later give to honor the priests who work in the temple.
Exactly. And so here is Abraham, the father of the Israelites, and he's honoring a royal priesthood that existed long before Israel's temple or their priests.
Melchizedek.
Yeah, he's super important. And we'll come back to him when we get to the story of David.
Okay, back to Abraham. We find out that he and Sarah are unable to have kids. And they're really old, so how are they going to have a family?
Well, they scheme up their own plan. Sarah forces her Egyptian slave to produce a child with Abraham. But once that happens, Sarah ends up despising her slave and oppressing her.
So instead of trusting God for a family, they do it on their own terms.
Right. And so God eventually does give them their own son, Isaac, but then God promptly asks for the life of that son back.
Abraham is called to offer up Isaac on a mountain as a sacrifice.
And we're told this is a test. God's requiring Abraham to own up to his failures, to stop his scheming, and to surrender his family's future to God.
Abraham and Isaac go up the mountain, build an altar, and right as Abraham is about to offer up his son,
God stops him, and he provides a substitute ram that can be sacrificed in Isaac's place. And here, the narrator stops the story and starts speaking to you, the reader, saying, "This is why we today say, on the mountain of Yahweh, it will be provided."
the mountain of Yahweh, that's Jerusalem.
That's right. And so notice, in both of these stories we've looked at, Abraham is near that high place that will later be called Jerusalem.
In the first story, Abraham meets a royal priest. And in the second story, God provides a substitute sacrifice that covers for the sins of Abraham's family.
Yes, and both of these stories point forward to the need for a future royal priest who will also become a sacrifice for the sins of Abraham and his family.
From here, Abraham's family grows to become an entire people. But they eventually end up as slaves in Egypt. And so, how can a group of slaves produce a royal priest?
Exactly. And so that brings us to Moses, whose story we're going to look at next.
So, God appoints a man named Moses to represent him to Pharaoh and to mediate on Israel's behalf.
Moses confronts Pharaoh and then leads Israel out of slavery and into the wilderness, where they eventually come to Mount Sinai. And here, God appears to all the Israelites, inviting them to become a kingdom of priests.
So he's inviting everyone to be priests, like Adam and Eve were priests in Eden.
Right. But it turns out the people are afraid of God, and they don't want to come close to God's presence, and so Moses goes alone up to the top of the mountain.
And up there, Moses famously gets the 10 Commandments. The first two being, worship Yahweh alone, and don't make idol statues.
And Moses sees some really amazing things up there. First, he sees God's heavenly temple, and then also a blueprint of it called the pattern.
All right, the plans for the construction of the tabernacle.
Yeah, it's designed as a symbolic model of Eden, a place where heaven and earth are one. Then Moses sees something else, the pattern of a glorious human figure.
The high priest who will work in the tabernacle.
Right, and only this priest can go in and out of the sacred space on behalf of others. He's dressed in white, he wears a crown and is glowing with jewels. He's an image of the royal priest that we're waiting for.
And yet, the man who's called to be Israel's first high priest is the brother of Moses, a man named Aaron.
And while Moses is up seeing all of this, down at the foot of the mountain, Aaron is misleading the people by making an idol statue of God.
So the soon-to-be high priest is breaking the first of the 10 Commandments.
Yes. And so God gets angry, and he tells Moses that he's done with these people. He'll just start over with Moses. But Moses stands before God, and he intercedes for the Israelites. He even offers his own life as a sacrifice for their sins.
And while God doesn't take Moses' life, he does forgive the people like Moses asked.
And so when Moses comes down from the mountain, he's shining, just like the high priest that he saw in his vision. It's like he's the real priest that his brother was supposed to be, but failed.
And from here, the tabernacle is built.
And then Aaron's family is installed to the priesthood.
But really, even after this bad start?
Yeah, and actually things get even worse. God gives Aaron and his sons really precise instructions on how to act as the priests. And then on their first day on the job, Aaron's two sons violate God's commands. And because they're in a place of great privilege and responsibility, God deals severely.
They die inside the tabernacle. Things are not looking good for the priesthood of Aaron.
Right, both Aaron and his sons have failed in their priestly role. And this begins to make us think, maybe God's people need a different kind of priesthood.
Maybe one that's more like Moses, who surrendered his very life over to God.
Yes, and while Moses is great, he also fails to be fully obedient to God. And so both he and Aaron die outside the land promised to Abraham.
So Moses was only an image of the kind of priest that God's people will need.
Right, we're still waiting for this ultimate royal priest who will intercede like Moses and offer his life for the failures of others.
The Israelites eventually make it into the promised land, and there they appoint a king and establish a kingdom. Perhaps now God's royal priest can arrive.
And this brings us to King David, and his story is what we're going to look at next. And so the people start asking for a king.
And eventually, God raises up David.
King David. And he's full of trust in Israel's God. In fact, with God's help, he defeats Israel's most powerful enemy.
All without proper weapons and without an army.
Now, not long after becoming king, David goes up into the high hills at the center of Israel's tribes, and he establishes a capital city, Jerusalem, otherwise known as Zion or the City of David, and it's like a new Eden.
This is the same hilltop Abraham visited. It's where he met Melchizedek, and it's where God provided a substitute sacrifice for Abraham's failures.
Exactly. And so David brings the tabernacle up into the city so he can make this the place of God's royal presence.
And during the inauguration, David's dancing with excitement.
Not only that, he deliberately dresses like Israel's high priest. And once the tabernacle arrives, he offers a sacrifice and makes this huge feast for all of the people, and he blesses them.
King David is acting like a new kind of priest.
Yes, and God approves. In fact, in the next story, God promises that from David's line will come a king who will reign forever and build the ultimate new Eden, a temple for God's presence.
David talks about this descendant to come in a poem we call Psalm 110.
Yeah, David recalls God's promise that one of his descendants will rule at God's right hand. And he goes on to say that this future king will be a priest like Melchizedek.
Yeah, Melchizedek, he's a priest king that even Abraham honored. Melchizedek's priesthood is older than Israel's priesthood.
Exactly.
But why can't David be that royal priest?
Well, David was pretty amazing sometimes, but he also failed. He slept with the wife of one of his soldiers, and then, in order to hide the whole affair, he had that man killed.
That's horrible.
It is. And his failures actually continued, leading up to this key moment where Israel's enemies were threatening to attack. And sadly, David doesn't trust God to deliver him like he did in his early days.
Right, he counts all of his soldiers. He's trusting his own power instead of trusting God.
And so God's not happy. He brings severe consequences on Israel. And David responds by surrendering to God and by offering his life as a substitute sacrifice on behalf of the people.
That's like Moses, who offered himself for the sins of the people.
And it's like Isaac, who was offered up for Abraham's sins, but then God provided a substitute.
I see, so there is a pattern here.
Right, and it's this pattern that leads us to the story of Jesus. He claimed to be the promised royal priest that the story's pointing to, the one who will bring the blessings of Eden and restore humans to their lost calling to fulfill God's promises to Abraham and David. And it's his story that we will look at next. But all is not lost. God promises that one of their descendants will come to intervene on their behalf and restore the blessings of Eden.
A new priest to restore the failed priests.
He's going to strike that deceiver while being struck by it. He's like a royal priest who becomes a sacrifice.
Now, through Israel's story, God raises up many people who could have been this royal priest, like Abraham, Moses, and David.
And they all fail, but their stories point forward, anticipating the ultimate royal priest.
And this brings us to Jesus.
Now, in the time of Jesus, the people of Israel were ruled by the Roman Empire, but they were governed by their own priests, including the high priest who worked in the Jerusalem temple.
The high priest was the only one who could enter the most holy space, and it was separated by a thick curtain embroidered with images of cherubim.
And the high priest at this time was a man named Caiaphas. He is the one who currently represents the people before God, but then Jesus came onto the scene.
And when we're introduced to Jesus, he's outside of Jerusalem at the Jordan River getting baptized. The skies open up and God says, "You are my son, whom I love. With you I am very pleased."
Now, these words blend together three statements from the Hebrew Scriptures that are all about the coming royal priest, who will be the king that God promised to raise up from the line of David, and also the beloved son, like Isaac was to Abraham. And he's the suffering royal servant of Isaiah who dies for the sins of his people.
This baptism is like his ordination as a royal priest.
Right. And so it's no surprise that afterwards Jesus starts going around acting like a priest.
All right, like forgiving people of their sins or restoring people who were impure so they could enter the temple.
These are the things that the priests who work in the Jerusalem temple were supposed to be doing.
But Jesus is doing it outside their authority. And so they start to see him as a threat.
And so this leads to a story where Jesus goes up with some friends to a high mountain, and there he's transformed. He starts shining, and all of his clothes become pure white.
This is like the vision Moses had of the ideal high priest.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus is here being revealed as the ultimate royal priest.
And it's here that Jesus decides that he's going to Jerusalem, even though he knows that he'll get killed.
And so later, when Jesus rides into Jerusalem, he challenges the authority of the current priesthood who are running things in the temple.
Like when he storms in and disrupts the sale of animal sacrifices.
Yeah, this is his way of showing he's the priest in charge.
And then later he's asked, "Who do you think you are?"
And so Jesus responds by quoting from Psalm 110 in Israel's scriptures. This is the psalm where King David speaks of someone that he calls his Lord, someone greater than him who will rule as a royal priest. Jesus is claiming that he is that priest.
This makes the priests in Jerusalem angry. So they have Jesus arrested, and they put him on trial before Caiaphas, the high priest, who asks Jesus, "Are you the anointed one?"
And what he means is, are you the royal priest? Because right now, that's my job. And Jesus responds once more by quoting Psalm 110, saying, "I am, and you are going to see me ruling at God's right hand."
But actually, we're about to see Jesus get killed. How is that ruling as a high priest?
Well, remember from Israel's scriptures, the pattern of the royal priest who surrenders himself as a sacrifice. Jesus is saying that offering his life for others is the way that he's going to ascend his royal throne.
When Jesus died, the curtain in the temple tore in two.
God's own life presence, the blessings of Eden that were once guarded and separate, now they can flow out of the temple to fill all of creation.
And when Jesus comes alive from the dead, he appears to his followers and commissions them to go out to the nations,
so that they can share the good news that Jesus is the ruling king and priest who's going to restore the blessings of Eden. This is why the Apostle Paul called Jesus the new Adam. He's inviting us back into Eden to become like him.
so that we can take up our lost calling of being God's royal priests.
Yes, and that new royal priesthood that's made up of the followers of Jesus, that's what we're going to explore next.
I hope you enjoyed that whole thing about priests, because the whole understanding of Melchizedek rests on understanding what the priesthood is all about. I think the key. And the second understanding is understanding the importance of Abraham to the Jews. For us, non-Jews as such, Abraham is just another great man of God. But for the Jews, Abraham is the father of the Jewish nation, literally. The founder of the Jewish nation. So Abraham is very well revered to the Jews. And because of that, what happened, what Abraham did before Melchizedek is so important, okay? This is taken from one of the concordance, okay? Now, Melchizedek, if you read Hebrews 7 and 8, okay, he's both the king of righteousness, that's what the name Melchizedek means, also king of Salem. As you know the video, Salem just a short form for Jerusalem. And Shalom is the Jewish word for peace. So it's both the king of righteousness and king of peace. Okay, and first encounter him in Genesis 14. After that, there's no mention of Melchizedek until about 1,000 years later in Psalm 110 by David. And then again, no mention of him until we come to Hebrews chapter 4, the first mention of Melchizedek. And again, chapter 5, and then after that, 7 and 8 that we're studying today. Okay, so Melchizedek is, in a way, a very mysterious figure that the writers of Hebrews try to be able to explain and take it as the new priesthood, new priestly line, because the Levites and Aaron line have failed. They are just, in a way, carrying out their priestly duty, but they are not doing it correctly. And it's in a way, a priest can only serve for about 25 years. You read the Leviticus, even though the line of Levi, you become a priest, you enter service at the age of 25. For 5 years, you apprentice, age 30. At age 30, you serve as a priest all the way to age 50. At age 50, you retire. So your actual priestly so-called line for each person about 25 years. Okay, that's according to Old Testament laws. And the Jews know all this. So the priestly line as such, okay, is not eternal, but is temporal as such. And the sacrifice, they will do it every year. But with this new line of Jesus, the high priest who gave the ultimate sacrifice of himself, and then that priesthood never ends. And this is referred to with the priesthood of Melchizedek, because he has no beginning, no end. No beginning, no end doesn't mean that he didn't die. There's no record of his death. Without father and mother, just means there's no record of who the father is or the mother is. There's a lot of speculation, but it's never clear. So he suddenly come onto the Bible, into biblical scene, disappears. David mentioned him, disappears, and certainly not Hebrews mentioned him. Okay, very mysterious as such. Okay. So there are 7 points that we need to highlight as you read Hebrews 7 and 8, 7 points, okay? We know from the Genesis 14 story that Abraham paid tithes to this Melchizedek. What are tithes? Tithes is about 10%, okay? And normally you pay tithe is a form of offering to God. Now, in the time of Abraham before Moses. Moses, the one who started the whole so-called priesthood with the 12 tribes, the Levi. So at the time of Abraham, there's no priest, no priesthood. And yet we have this king of Salem, Melchizedek, who seems to be a high priest, at the same time a king, a priest and king, which is a very rare combination in the Bible. And here Abraham gave him tithes, 10% of what he had, okay, which means they're literally worshipping and giving to God the 10%. Not Melchizedek as God, but as a representative of God in that sense, okay? Because subsequently with Moses' time, the people came to give tithes to the Levi. They give to the Levi, and Levi, that's how they are supported as a people. They got no land, but they are given tithes as their portion of the inheritance. Okay. Secondly, it's recorded in Hebrews in Genesis 14 that Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Now the blessing is always somebody superior to bless somebody inferior. There's always the blessing. Okay, superior to inferior, which means the fact that the Bible records in Genesis that Melchizedek blessed Abraham, which means that Melchizedek is above Abraham. And for the Jews, this is something they find very hard to understand, because to them, Abraham is the founder, the leader, he's the highest. And suddenly now got somebody above him. Melchizedek blessed Abraham. That's what the Bible records. Okay, we'll keep that in mind. Thirdly, he's the priest, he's a type of a priest who lives forever. Like I said, he has no genealogy that we know about. Okay, we don't know where he came from or when he died. The Bible does not record that. Doesn't mean that he's still alive. Okay, but just the Bible don't record it and he's silent. Okay, so to the writer of Hebrews, it seems as if he's a priest who lives forever. And this is the type of priesthood that Jesus came to institute. Jesus came to start that priesthood that will never end. Okay? Now, point number 4 is for the Jews is also very important. Levi, who's part of the Jewish 12 tribes, yet unborn, paid him tithes in the person of Abraham. So Levi will be finally come off Isaac, Jacob, and all that. So Levi was still literally in the loin of Abraham when Abraham paid tithes, which means Levi, in the manner of speaking, also paid tithes. Okay, and for the Jews, this is something unthinkable, because to a Jew, you bring your tithes to the priest. There's a descendant of Levi. And here the writer of Hebrews says, even Levi paid tithes through Abraham to this Melchizedek. Okay, that's one point. The 5th point is, it's a permanent priesthood. Okay, means once you set it up, you go on forever. And the Levitical priesthood that's imperfect is broken. It's broken. So we are no longer based on sacrifice and sacrifice for our sins. But now forgiveness is directly from God. And the curtain in the temple is torn top to bottom. Now you and I have access to God Almighty. No longer need the intervening priest to take our sacrifices and sacrifice on our behalf. Now we can go to God directly through what Jesus, God's Son, has done. I think that's important. Lastly, he was made priest not without an oath, but his priesthood can neither be transmitted nor interrupted by death. This man, because he continued ever in unchanging priesthood, means there's no end to the priesthood. We don't know its beginning. There's no end to it, and continues forever and ever. Okay, so these are the so-called salient points of these 2 chapters. I won't go through it verse by verse as usual, but I think it will give you an understanding of the priesthood, how important is it to the Jews, and yet here we suddenly got Melchizedek, also a priest, not of the line of Levi, a very mysterious figure that came on. No understanding of his background, no understanding of his death. But David alluded to him, you are a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And this is what Hebrews 7 and 8 is trying to tell us, that this is a new priestly line that will never end and will continue to be effective, because Jesus comes in that line and lineage of Melchizedek and not of the Levites or Levitical priesthood. I think there's something that we need to understand, and the importance of Abraham paying homage to this Melchizedek make all that difference.